about examples that it's often in a judgmental stance. It's easy to say that, Nazi Germany was one big example of groupthink. What about the United States, the cultural movement to legalize gay marriage and to stop oppressing LGBTQIA people? I don't know how many people would say that that's herd mentality, but I could see how you might label it as groupthink. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. You're right. I mean, just the name mob mentality or herd mentality, you think of a wild mob gone a ruckus, and you don't think about people coming together for good things, which happens all the time as well. So I think that's a solid point. I think of mob mentality or groupthink, and you're right, it does have 1,000 different names. People as a group are a different entity than an individual person.
Were locked onto targets across the Soviet Union. The defining event of the Cold War, it would see the world's leading superpowers fight in a dangerous battle for nuclear superiority just 90 miles from the American coast. For 13 days in October 1962, American Presidents John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev would engage in a battle of wills where one wrong move could lead to global destruction. Time was ticking, and neither side knew how events were about to unfold. By 1962, Cold War tensions were at an all-time high, with disputes won by the side with the biggest nuclear arsenal. The United States had maintained a significant lead in the arms race since the conflict began, and had already installed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey.
Out, and the reason why I wrote the book Real Magic, that what we study within a scientific context, something like clairvoyance, in the magical tradition would be called divination, because divination is all about perceiving through space and time. That is exactly what clairvoyance is all about, perceiving through space and time. And there are proper, validated scientific ways of testing whether that's actually a real thing. And the short story is, yeah, it is a real thing. We can test it. So we have divination as a magical practice. We have something I call force of will, which is impressing your will onto the world and making it do things according to your will. And the third category is theurgy, which is communicating with or dealing with spirits or invisible, sometimes non-human entities of one type or another. So in each of these three classes, divination, force of will, and theurgy, there are analogs in the scientific world which have been
None of Walt Disney's main characters were to be used, out of fear of cheapening their image, but for whatever reason, using them for a jazzercise series on the Disney Channel was somehow seen as less cheapening of their image.
Hi, Musketeers! Hi, Dinky! Let's exercise!
So 3 completely original television shows began production, which made their debut in 1985. The first was Floppy Dogs, which unfortunately had awful viewership for its movie pilot, so it was scrapped as a series. The Wuzzles fared a bit better, but it was the Gummy Bears that really took off, proving Disney could produce high quality.
The Portuguese would also set up colonies in the Spice Islands, Hormuz in Persia, and, important to this story, in Oman. The Spanish and Portuguese had agreed to divide the world in two, so they had little competition from Europeans in Africa. But late in the 16th century, the Iberian Union united Portugal with Spain, and as such, the Portuguese entered into Spain's wars against the Dutch and the English. The Dutch were quick to move into the colonial game and took Mina from the Portuguese. They expanded in West Africa, established the Dutch slave coast, and built forts in Senegal. Plus, for a few decades, they even held Portuguese Luanda. While in the south, in the middle of the 17th century, they entered Cape Town, an important midway point for ships sailing between the oceans. The Dutch that settled in this region became the Boers. However, the locals in South Africa that they encountered during this period were not the Zulu, they were the Khoekhoe. These are often grouped together with the San hunter-gatherers, but they were a distinct group of people. The Zulu on the
Francis Drake grew up in Plymouth, which is in the west country of England. And he would have been surrounded by sailors and sailing culture.
Having already spent years of his life at sea, Francis Drake set sail for West Africa under the command of his wealthy cousin, John Hawkins, an experienced captain who built his fortune in a most sinister industry. Hawkins was an early profiteer of the transatlantic slave trade.
Piracy has an interesting relationship with the history of the slave trade. The first slave traders were, in fact, pirates. In many ways, the slave trade itself was associated with piracy. Sir John Hawkins, Drake's cousin, was one of England's first slave traders.
In the late 15th century and then into the 16th century, the Spanish controlled the transportation of enslaved Africans to the Americas. They were the dominant power, and essentially
So imagine, first of all, that there's two kinds of equality that you might pursue. One would be equality of opportunity. And so that would mean that, there's wide range of talent across people regardless of their type, whatever that might be, sex, gender, race, ethnicity. There's talent distributed everywhere. And it's a kind of a truism, and I would say a truism of the West in the deepest sense, that each of the individuals within those groups should be put in a position where their talents they're encouraged to manifest those talents, partly because that would be good for them spiritually and psychologically, but also because that would be of obvious benefit to the community. Right? I mean, talent's rare, which people don't understand. There's lots of different kinds of talent, but in each domain it's rare. And so it's to everyone's benefit to exploit talented people to the maximal possible degree. So even if you're just selfish, you'd want to push for equality.
You'll discover the little-known prophecy that foretold her fate, the secret religious texts that influenced her thinking, and the private letters that reveal her true character. This is Anne Boleyn, as you've never seen her before. Brilliant, flawed, ambitious, and ultimately human. The mists that shroud the Kentish countryside seem to conspire with history to obscure the beginnings of England's most controversial queen. Even the year of Anne Boleyn's birth remains a subject of scholarly debate. Was it 1501 or 1507? This uncertainty would prove oddly prophetic for a woman whose life would become enshrouded in rumor, speculation, and mystery. On a crisp autumn morning at Blickling Hall in Norfolk,
Like, the article was not that crazy because everything that these conservative influencers have been saying is actually very accurate and very balanced. Like,
I'm going to have to go find the article.
Brought up Alex Clark, and she is very vocally, against birth control. And they quoted her in this article and said that Clark wrote, birth control can be right for some in some cases, but we shouldn't just take it blindly because of acne, and we shouldn't treat it as the default for all women. That is a very rational and balanced statement.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to some extent I would agree with that, but it's reasonable for someone to be on contraception for acne. That is a around the world option for the treatment of hormonal acne. You can't just sandwich two truths around a statement that you tangentially decided was applicable because of those two truths. So is it true that we shouldn't treat it as the right thing for all people? Yeah. Is it true that you should have all the information before being given it? Yeah.